hand you over to Don.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and I'm really, really happy to be here. The Dyslexia Association of Ireland knows that I'm always ready to support them and always ready to support children with dyslexia and adults with dyslexia, and also parents who may be concerned if a child is diagnosed with dyslexia. In some ways, the diagnosis is actually a blessing in that my dyslexia was not diagnosed until I was 38 years of age. And I had a tough time in primary school. At the time in the 1960s, the early 1960s, they wouldn't really have known much about dyslexia. So the assumption of some teachers was, reading and writing difficulties and manifesting itself in poor spelling and so on, and the inability to grasp grammar and so on, that it lacked grey matter or that you were lazy. All of those kind of things that were, put upon us. And that certainly impacts in the sense that, at that age, teachers are almost like gods. They're people on pedestals. And when they speak, it's something that you take very seriously, and it leaves a very, very deep impression. But perhaps the most difficult moment of my life as a dyslexic child, without knowing it, was in the North. They have the 11+ examination, which I really think is a horrendous examination, particularly for young people, because in a sense it marks them for life. And the idea is that you do an intelligence test and that this will determine the direction of your life. If you pass it, then the chances are you'll go to a college and a much more academically inclined career, professional career, or if you fail it, much more towards a vocational occupation. And I was struggling, and we were told that the average intelligence was 100, was marked as 100, and I was scoring like sometimes as low as 78, and maybe if I was lucky I might get 91, but never hitting the 100, which suggested I was educationally subnormal. So again, you can imagine the impact that was having. And then about 3 weeks before the 11+ examination, in the primary school that I attended, they brought a particular teacher in whom I describe as Master G. And his job was to prepare us for the 11+ and put us through all sorts of tests during those 3 weeks. And then near the end, he informed us that he was going to call out a list of names of boys that he felt should go forward to do the 11+. And he called out all the list, and my name was not on it. So I put my hand up and I said, sir, my name's not on the list, and my mother wants me to do it. And I always remember he looked at me and he put his head down and he began to write in the book, but he said very caustically, loud enough for me to hear and for the rest of the class to hear, so much so that they all burst out laughing. He said, you've no chance. And that really impacted me. And I carry that with me all of my life. I mean, I had this echo in my head of you've no chance, you've no chance. And so that, really, I suppose, created profound self-doubt and an inferiority complex and low self-esteem for a long time. And things began to change. And I think this is a really important little story for parents, particularly of children with dyslexia. I know that my mother and father would have had concerns. I can certainly remember one time being in my granny's, my maternal granny's house, and I remember adults in the kitchen whispering and talking about how slow I was. And, and again, I knew exactly what they were talking about. And it really impacted, that. But my mother especially, she intuitively knew that I had more than some of the teachers were giving me credit for. And one thing that she held on to was my very first primary school teacher, Mrs. Jackson, my mother had actually grown up with her. And she told my mother that, you know, I would be maybe a slow starter, but when I took off, I'd leave a lot of people behind. And my mother always held on to that, you know, and she did a lot to try and get me extra tuition and so on, particularly when I went to secondary school. But a really important thing happened in 1966, and both my parents realized that this was to be encouraged, not to be discouraged. And it was tonight, we're missing the start of the first semi-final of the 2022 World Cup. Well, in 1966, we had the first World Cup that was ever broadcast live coming from England. And at the end of the games, all of the boys would go to the local green, and the two best players would pick the teams that they thought were best players in descending order of perceived talent. And the last two picked had only one choice, and that was goalkeeper. And that's how I became a goalkeeper. But I discovered that I had very good handling, good reflexes, good agility, and I grew to love the position. And the very first full game that I ever watched was the 1966 World Cup final between England and what was then West Germany. And the England goalkeeper was Gordon Banks. You probably can see a painting I have over my shoulder of Gordon Banks. And that day he became my absolute hero. And I began to take this, develop this fascination with Gordon Banks. And I would look through the papers, I would go to the library, search through books to find anything and everything that was written about Gordon Banks. And this is where I think my parents, you know, had a really important insight, in that they realized that here was somebody heretofore who really didn't particularly like to read or to write. And now I'd found an interest, and they encouraged that interest. And to this day, I actually still keep, I have it here beside me just to show you. One day I went with my mother to a paint and decorating shop, and she was looking for new wallpaper. And she was looking through these big books that you would have had back in the mid 1960s. And I realized that one of these books could be a great scrapbook. And I asked the man in the shop if he could give me one, and he gave me this. Some older people, maybe around my generation, might remember this. And over the next number of years, everything that I could get relative to Gordon Banks, I mean, I collected in this particular book, you know, and it's actually my first book. It probably needs to go into a museum at this stage because it's well over 50 years old now, but something I've always treasured. And so that's the first thing. If a dyslexic child has an interest, it's really important to encourage that interest, because they are picking up important skills along the way. And you know, through goalkeeping, I began to develop an identity. I became a really good goalkeeper. I was simultaneously the under 13 and the under 15 goalkeeper when I was in school. And just for a 13-year-old to step up at that age was, for under 15, was pretty huge indeed. So so that was really, I suppose, the early stages of my dyslexia. But still, even when I went to college, getting through college, I felt that I had got through by default. You know, that they really hadn't found me out. Because again, I was carrying a lot of these self-doubts that, you know, I had picked up from primary school. Now, along the way, I met wonderful teachers. And in fact, in my primary school, I write about this actually on my website. There is a Master John Flood who sadly passed away last year. And I actually went up, you know, for his funeral, because there are there are some people who've really made a huge mark, you know, in your life, and it's a way of paying them respects and saying their goodbyes and saying thank you as well for what they did. But the one thing I always remember about Master Flood in primary school, he was my first male teacher, was I remember songs that he taught me, you know, the October Winds, Laments Around the Castle of Dromore, and a beautiful, very happy song about when the sun in the morning creeps over the hills and kisses the window, the flowers of my windowsill. The Mockingbird Hill, I think it's called. You know, I remember those, but other than that, I don't really remember any other thing other than kindness. The one thing I remember about Master Flood is kindness. And, you know, I think it was Maya Angelou who famously said that people may not remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And particularly for teachers, you know, it's so important to understand the power of words and the impact for good or ill that our words can have. And that's why they need to be chosen very, very, very carefully. And in secondary school, we had wonderful teachers, particularly in the Troubles, because like I grew up in the Craigan Estate in Derry, which, you know, was really caught in the heartland of the Troubles in the north of Ireland. Most of the victims of Bloody Sunday, for example, came from the Craigan, and the funerals came from our local parish church. And I myself, as a young boy of 15, was caught in the vortex of the killing fields on Bloody Sunday, all of which had huge, huge impacts on me. And you know, so I struggled, you know, again professionally through life. I remember as director of AFRI, I sometimes would have to go to various meetings, and minutes would be handed out, and people would read them in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and I might still be only halfway down the page and have to pretend that I'd read them. Because again, you had this terrible shame associated with it. And at the age of 38, something quite remarkable happened. And I was working on a big project called the Great Famine Project. And one of the questions that I raised in relation to the Great Hunger of 1845 to 1852 was if over 1 million of our people died of starvation and hunger-related diseases, where were they buried? And when I asked that question, a lot of people said, yeah. And then I discovered that, you know, there were literally hundreds of unmarked mass graves with thousands of poor people buried in them. And I began a process of trying to have them identified and set aside with a simple dignity. And a teacher came from Dunshaughlin, where there is a workhouse, to say that, you know, there is a mass grave at the back of the workhouse and they want to do work with us. And at a certain point, she said, Don, where do you get your energy from? And I said to her, hey, I've always had good energy. She says, no, there's a deeper energy there. And then she asked me, did I ever hear kinesiology? I said, no. So she told me it was a new kind of new age science of checking the flow of energy in the body. And she told me of a nun called Sister Therese Kennelly and suggested I go and see her. She was up in Westmeath, at Devlin in Westmeath. I courteously took down the name and the phone number, but I really had no intention of ever contacting her. But one morning I came into work, there was no one there, the mail was there, I brought it into the main office, and I had created a number of famine walks. There's one in Mayo, a lot of people don't know it's annual, but I actually created it way back in 1988, and I had done 2 other walks, and an English magazine called The Tablet, they did an article on it, and I began to get letters from England. And the interesting thing was it was mainly from Anglican ministers. And this particular morning, I opened up a letter, and it was another letter from an Anglican minister, at the end of which he said, I believe you're doing the work of the Holy Spirit. And I remember going, whew, you know, I just kind of got a chill, but I can't explain it at that moment. It was like someone lifted me, and I walked to an old, still see it, it was an orange colored fax machine, the old fax machine, and you could actually make phone calls out with the fax machines. And I phoned the number that the teacher gave me for this nun, and I got her secretary. And her secretary said, well, she's actually booked up for 3-4 months. So we'll have to, do it in advance. So I was going through my diary. And then she said, however, we have an appointment first thing this afternoon. If you can get up here. And I said, put me down. And I get into the car and I drove the 60 miles to Devlin. And when eventually I met the nun, she said, why are you here? And I said, sister, to tell you the God's honest truth, I have no idea. So she said, that's fine. She sat me down and she made me stretch my arm out, and she stood behind and she put pressure on my arm as she asked different questions. And she started to concentrate and focus on my childhood, school. Then she put X's in the ground and parallel lines, got me to look at those. And the next thing was, she said, do you realize you're dyslexic? Now, it was almost like Muhammad Ali, giving you a knockout punch, because I had seen some programs on BBC and I could see patterns that I could identify with. But I remember I had a friend, a priest friend, who was actually an author. And I remember saying to him, I said, Father Jim, I think I'm dyslexic. And he said, you couldn't be dyslexic, don't you? You get through like college and university and stuff like that. So I kind of dismissed it. But then this particular nun raised the possibilities. But for me, this idea of stretching your arm out and checking, the movement of energy, it was a bit wacko. So I needed to kind of maybe get a more traditional kind of assessment. So I contacted my sister Deirdre, who is a teacher by profession, was working at Thornhill College at the time, a nun, and I asked her, could she put me in contact with teachers who were dealing with children with learning disabilities, which she did. And eventually, through those contacts, I was led to a top educational psychologist in County Wicklow. And she agreed to do a major assessment on me, which also included, over a 5-hour period, 2 intelligence tests. And I remember when I was sitting the intelligence test, I said to her, there's a little 10 or 11-year-old boy inside me and he's terrified. She said, that's okay. But she got me to work through it. And I always remember, at the end of the first one, I was moving into the second test, and she said, Don, I don't need you to do the second test. She says, I can see you're a highly intelligent person. But for me, that wasn't enough. I had to do the second one because, again, I was doubting myself. Maybe I had just managed to get through this, And anyway, at the end of it, she told me that, not only was I intelligent, but she said I was in the top 5%. So you can imagine the impact that had on me and how it changed my whole perception of myself. And that's when I realized, that the importance of having dyslexia identified and diagnosed. But also, I realized then that, dyslexia, it's not a disease. It's not some kind of a mental impairment. In fact, it's a gift. Because I realized, looking back, that one of the great strengths that I always had coming through life, and still have to this day, is my imagination and the ability to see the bigger picture. Maybe that's why, as a goalkeeper, you're there and you're watching the whole game, whereas people in the middle of the field are really kind of concentrating on what's going around midfield and so on, whereas the goalkeeper has the bigger view. And I also realized that, in a sense, it's our brains are wired differently. And the simplest way I can explain this is that most people, if they're reading, they can go from A to B directly. Whereas for a dyslexic, we have to go from A to C to B. Now, it takes a bit longer and it takes more effort, but on that journey, we can actually pick up a lot more information, and we can actually see a lot more detail that maybe people who are going directly from A to B will actually miss out. And then suddenly I found myself, involved in all sorts of things. I was back in Derry one day, and I was walking up Roswell Street where Bloody Sunday happened. And I met Tony Doherty, whose father had been shot dead on Bloody Sunday. And he knew my work in AFRI. my human rights work, and I'd never met Tony before. I was quite surprised how knowledgeable he was. But then he said, and I read your statement, Don, and I said, what statement? He said, the one you gave on Bloody Sunday. I had completely forgotten, but when he said that, I remember as a boy with friends and an older friend saying, when I told him what I'd witnessed, you know, at the barricade on Bloody Sunday, he said, Don, they're taking statements in the Holy Child Primary School in the Craigan, and I think you should go and give a statement. So I went there and I made the statement. So now I became curious all those years later, nearly 25 years later, what it was I'd written. And the following week I was back in Derry. I went to the Pat Finucane Centre with two of the Bloody Sunday families. They brought me to an old battered filing cabinet. And I remember they searched through it, and eventually they pulled out a well-worn plastic supermarket bag about that thick, you know, and they said, your statement in there. And I started to go through them, and I realized that I was in possession of primary source historical documents about one of the seminal events of modern Irish history, and the modern British history as well. And I had the idea that I would do a book, and I asked the families for their permission, and they did. And little did I foresee the impact that the book would have. It became a bestseller. It inspired an award-winning movie called Bloody Sunday. The director, Paul Greengrass, through that movie, which won Sundance and the Berlin Golden Bear, was propelled into Hollywood, where he now works with Tom Hanks and Matt Damon. And also the book is credited officially as being a primary catalyst for the new Bloody Sunday inquiry, which became the longest running and most expensive in British legal history. And of course, it led in 2010 to the apology from Prime Minister Cameron, in which he described the events of Bloody Sunday as unjustified and unjustifiable. And then, you know, I did a book of the Dublin Monaghan bombings. Last week, you may have heard about Donald de Roysta, who, the brother of Eddie Roach, who has now been exonerated by the Irish government, an apology offered. I did a book about Donald. So I did 3 major investigative books, all of which led to various inquiries. Little did I know that I had that capacity and capability inside me. Little did I know that I'd work on movies or documentaries. And but the important thing, and there is a, you know, the Dyslexia Association of Ireland can lead you to, or you can find it on my website, to an essay I wrote called Breaking Free of the Lie. And the lie was that I was stupid. And that's the terrible thing very often, because we start off struggling with words, struggling, you know, to read sentences, and even having maybe difficulties with maths and so on, that you can really feel that you're having a hard time. And therefore, you know, those self-doubts and that terrible sense that you're stupid can really begin to, you know, can really impact us. Whereas we need to realize that, you know, yeah, dyslexia is a challenge. You know, there are challenges that we have to face. But if we can see it as a gift, if we can see it as, you know, a very unique way of seeing the world, of encountering the world, and very often what you'll find is, as I mentioned earlier, dyslexic people are very creative. You know, so we have other gifts that more than compensate for the difficulties that we might have in reading and writing. Can I also say as well, I'd mentioned this to Nicola earlier, we just had a little conversation earlier. Prior to this, there was a period when I was unemployed for 6 months, and I wanted to use the time as constructively as possible. And this was before the computer revolution. But I decided to learn to touch type. And I remember going in Derry to the Strand Technical College, and I was the only guy in the evenings in the class. It was all women who were there. And I still remember ASDF semicolon LKJ, ASDF semicolon LKJ, until it became automatic. And learning to touch type was one of the greatest skills that I ever had. I never realized, of course, that this computer revolution was coming, because it was an old kind of metal typewriters, and they were heavy to carry when you even portable ones. But it was a great gift, you know. And now, like, I mean, I can work away on my computer. I don't have to look down at the keypad. And of course, built into computers now, which is really helpful for people with it. And by the way, I still struggle, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I still struggle with spelling. There are just certain spellings I can't get, but the great thing is now you'll have spell checks to help you, and you'll have a red line coming off to indicate that, you know, it's not spelled properly. And of course, there's grammar checks as well. That's the other thing I mentioned to Nicola today as well. I write by sound. You know, even when I read, by the way, I have to sub-vocalize. I have to hear the sound in my head to fully understand it. And it's the same too, but when I write by sound. I know when I read the sentence back if I have put all the words in the right order. And if you ask me to dissect that sentence or a paragraph in terms of verbs and adverbs and nouns and pronouns, I haven't a clue. I was never ever able to learn it, and I've no particular interest in learning it as well, because I have a good ear and I write by sound. But I also have because I read slowly, and I think this is why my 3 investigative books had such you know, an important impact. It was because I was able to analyze and see things that maybe people who are reading very fast actually don't see. So look, there's a kind of a general oversight in terms of my experience. I'm not ashamed of being dyslexic. I'm very happy to say it, you know, publicly, because I know that there are other people out there, some of whom maybe are, you know, maybe living without realizing that they are dyslexic, and I'd really encourage them to do what I did, which is to go and have it assessed. And also, there may be people who know they're dyslexic and feel ashamed and don't want to admit it. But for me, the discovery that I'm dyslexic was actually one of the milestones of my life and changed the entire direction of my life. And so that's why I have a great love for the Dyslexia Association of Ireland and the Dyslexia Associations all over the world. And if I can be of any help and any support or inspiration to, as I said, children or adults with dyslexia or parents with dyslexia, then I'm happy to do that. The other thing is, in my book, Gordon Banks, A Hero Who Could Fly, it's my boyhood memoir, I write about my dyslexia, and I'm very happy to make a donation of a number of the books to the association, so that if people would like to maybe get a copy of that book, they can get it through the association. And if you want to make a donation to the association, great. If not, it certainly won't be held back from you. So there we are. That's kind of it in a nutshell. And I'm just trying to see the time here now. So yeah, that's about a half an hour that we talked about, Nicola. So I'm happy to turn it over. And if there's any questions that you, Nicola, or Quiva, or anybody who's listening would like to ask,